Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution by natural selection based on a couple of observations and a couple of inferences that he made from those observations. The first observation is that members of a population vary in inherited traits. And there are really two things in there. One, there is variation in traits. Two, that variation in those traits is heritable, meaning it's passed on from one generation to the next. For example, if you look at this collection of ladybugs, they vary in a lot of ways. They vary in size. Some of them are larger, some of them are smaller. They vary in color. Some are darker orange, some are almost yellow. They vary in number and size of spots, and there are probably hundreds and really thousands of other characteristics that they vary in. We just don't know enough about ladybugs, you and I, to know what those variations are. So there's variation in population, right? You can look around the world and easily tell that within a species there's variation. And we also know that those traits tend to be heritable, right? We all know that, even if back in the day they didn't know that it was genes that were carrying that information, everyone knew that, John has his mother's nose and his father's ears, or whatever that may be. So there is variation in inherited traits. Observation 2 was that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support. And if that's the case, then there's competition for resources, and many of those offspring are going to fail to survive and reproduce. And Darwin noted this because he was reading a book by someone named Thomas Malthus called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And Malthus noted this for humans, right? He was a mathematician, and he noted that any positive growth rate, if held up consistently across generations, leads to exponential growth. And he was predicting that humans were going to show exponential growth, which we are. And he was predicting that exponential growth was going to cause problems. Well, Darwin was less interested in humans and more interested in the idea that, that exponential growth doesn't just happen for humans, it happens for any kind of organism that has a positive growth rate. And again, eventually, given all these resources in an empty environment, those resources are going to allow you to reproduce a lot, and you are eventually going to fill up an environment, and that will create competition. So, observation 1, we vary in inherited traits, right? Two important things there. Observation 2, there will be competition, essentially. Organisms will reproduce until they have filled up the ecosystem, the environment, and there will be competition. So, for instance, you look at the spore cloud from this particular fungus, right? There are thousands and thousands of individual spores there. Each of them, if there are enough resources, could theoretically grow to become an adult organism. From those two observations, Darwin made two inferences. First is that, if there's competition among individuals and there's variation in those traits, individuals who inherited traits that give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a particular environment will tend to be able to then reproduce more themselves and leave more offspring than other individuals, right? If there's variation, for instance, in how fast you grow among plants, and there's competition for light, right? Those who happen to have genes that make them grow faster are going to be able to capture that light more quickly, shade out those around them. And so if light is a limiting resource in a particular environment, then there's going to be selection pressure to grow faster, and you may find individuals growing more quickly. Inference 2, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to an accumulation of favorable traits in the population over generations. In other words, if some individuals with some characteristics are better able to survive and reproduce, and their offspring have their genes, they will then be better able to survive and reproduce over many, many, many generations. If you look at a population in generation 1 and a population in generation 500, the population in generation 500 is going to look different in terms of their characteristics. They're going to match their environment more closely. Heritable advantageous traits will accumulate in a population, and traits that are disadvantageous will tend to decrease and fall out of the population. So to summarize, individuals with certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate. Natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their specific environment over time. And this isn't a static thing because environments change over time. And so what may have made you more fit at one point, right, maybe hundreds of years later, may not be so advantageous, right? What nature selects can change over time. And this can lead to individuals that very, very closely match their very specific environment. So this is a look at two mantids, one in Malaysia, one in Borneo, so they're not that far away from one another. And this mantid lives on orchid flowers, and it looks just like orchid flowers. This mantid in Borneo lives among dried leaf litter, and it looks just like dried leaf litter. One quick thing I want to note, individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve. Evolution has to take place across generations over time. So I cannot move to a drier climate and evolve to better fit that drier climate. Now, we have some adaptation that can occur, not evolutionary adaptation, but you kind of get used to the cold if you move to Alaska. That's not evolution, right? That's your body's physiological response. Evolution has to occur across generations over time in a population. Now, new hypotheses, when they pop up, are assumed to be incorrect, right, until evidence accumulates on their behalf, right? We have hypotheses, we test them, and then we look at the results of those tests, and evidence builds up that either supports your hypothesis or rejects it, and then you have to modify your hypothesis and go back and try again. Evolution by natural selection has been backed up for 150 years, and if you look at scientific journals, biological journals right now, the pages are just filled with examples of evolution and evidence for it. One example is soapberry bugs that you find in Florida. So soapberry bugs have what's called a beak. It's not like a bird beak, but they use it to dig into fruits and feed on the seeds that are within those fruits. And in southern Florida, they feed on balloon vine, which is a larger fruit, so they have to have longer beaks to get to that seed. In central Florida, they feed on the golden rain tree, which is a smaller fruit, so they don't need really long beaks. They save energy by having shorter beaks. And you can tell by looking at a soapberry bug whether they came from central or southern Florida. There's been a similar correlation between fruit size and beak that's been observed in other places where you find soapberry bugs as well. And there have been cases in a number of different places with soapberry bugs, including Florida, where when introduced plants pop up, the population evolves in response to the new plants. So in Florida, in less than 35 years, we've begun to see a change in the average beak size of soapberry bugs. This, by the way, is a look at a soapberry bug, and this is a balloon vine fruit with the big, thick fruit. And if you look, in Florida, we have an introduced species of fruit that has smaller fruit. And if you look at museum specimens from, again, about 35 years ago, this is the average beak length, right? Because they tend to be working on these thick fruits. Over just a few decades, if you look at the current average, it's much, much, much shorter because now this introduced berry has taken over. Their beaks don't need to be as long, and long beaks take energy to produce. And so you've seen evolution before your very eyes. Another example of evolution that we witness ourselves these days is, and I will scooch over here so you can see our Staphylococcus, is evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. So Staphylococcus aureus is found on people all the time, and usually it's fine, but occasionally due to immune systems or some abrasion on your skin, you can get a Staphylococcus infection. And usually we can get rid of it with antibiotics. Specifically, we'd use methicillin. But now, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus has evolved. It's a strain of staph that is no longer susceptible to methicillin, and that methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus we call MRSA, MRSA, and it's become very dangerous. So Staphylococcus aureus, we originally treated with penicillin, right, the first antibiotic. Back in 1945, it became resistant to penicillin, and so then methicillin is what we used. And then less than 2 decades later, it became resistant to methicillin. And we don't just know that this happened. We know specifically how it happened, because we know how methicillin works. It works by inhibiting a protein that bacteria use in their cell walls. MRSA bacteria evolved to use a different protein, and we know where that happened in the genes, right? We can pick it out, and there are now staph species, or staph strains, I should say, that have evolved resistance to other bacteria, other antibiotics as well. Now, it's important to remember that natural selection does not create new traits, but it does sort of use existing variation to edit and select for traits that are present in the population that are more beneficial than other traits. And the local environment is going to determine what traits are selected. It's mutation that can cause new traits to pop up, and mutation is not particularly rare. You learned last semester about how your body makes a great attempt at avoiding errors in copying of your DNA, but you copy your DNA a lot. And so errors do pop up, and very often they are harmful. Very often they have no impact whatsoever, but occasionally they can be beneficial. Again, beneficial or harmful often depends on the context. It depends on which environment you happen to be in.